Golden late-afternoon sunlight spilled through the towering windows of Whitmore Hall, painting ribbons of amber across polished marble floors where two identical 7-year-old boys chased one another with breathless laughter. Thomas darted around a carved fountain in the central courtyard while his twin brother, Henry, followed close behind, both convinced they were fearless knights defending an imaginary kingdom from invisible dragons. Their delighted shouts echoed through the grand estate, replacing the silence that so often haunted noble houses with the joyful chaos only children could create. Watching from the garden path, Duchess Eleanor Whitmore laughed with unguarded warmth, her gentle voice carrying effortlessly through the roses as she pretended to surrender to their endless games. Every servant adored her because kindness seemed as natural to Eleanor as breathing. She remembered birthdays, comforted frightened maids, visited sick tenants without announcement, and never passed a stable hand or kitchen maid without speaking their name. To the people of Whitmore Hall, she was not merely their duchess but the quiet heart that kept the vast household beating with compassion instead of cold ceremony. Wherever she walked, anxious faces softened, and even the oldest footmen found themselves smiling before realizing why. Beyond the estate gates, however, another reputation ruled the countryside. Duke Alexander Whitmore was known as a stern master, a disciplined statesman whose judgment rarely wavered and whose word carried unquestioned authority. Merchants negotiated carefully around him, neighboring nobles respected him, and dishonest men feared him. Yet every evening as his carriage rolled beneath Whitmore Hall's stone archway, that intimidating reputation disappeared almost instantly. The moment the horses stopped, Thomas and Henry sprinted across the entrance hall before the servants could announce their father's arrival. Alexander barely stepped onto the marble floor before both boys collided happily against him. Laughing despite himself, he lifted one child beneath each arm as though they weighed nothing at all. Their excited voices overlapped while they competed to describe the day's adventures, and the Duke listened with complete attention, asking questions that made each twin feel wonderfully important. His stern expression dissolved into unmistakable affection. Eleanor watched from the sweeping staircase above, her eyes shining with quiet contentment. When Alexander finally looked up, their smiles met long before they reached one another. He climbed the stairs slowly, dismissed every servant with a nod, and gently kissed her forehead. "I thought London might keep you another night," she whispered. "There isn't a parliament in Europe important enough to steal an evening from you three." "For," Henry protested from below. Alexander chuckled. "You're right. For." Dinner unfolded beneath glittering chandeliers, yet the grandeur mattered less than the warmth surrounding the table. Thomas carefully explained a bird's nest he had discovered in the orchard, while Henry proudly displayed muddy sleeves earned from rescuing an injured rabbit. Eleanor teased Alexander for pretending not to notice the stains, and even the Duke surrendered with playful defeat. Laughter flowed as freely as the candlelight, making Whitmore Hall feel less like an ancient palace than a family home built upon unwavering trust. Standing quietly near the doorway, the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, watched the scene with grateful eyes. She had served 3 generations of Whitmores and believed she had witnessed every kind of happiness and sorrow life could invent. Yet something about this family felt unusually precious, almost fragile in its perfection. Nearby stood Alexander's cousin, Reginald Ashford, impeccably dressed and smiling with effortless charm as he applauded Henry's exaggerated story. Anyone observing him would have mistaken admiration for the emotion crossing his face. Only Mrs. Pruitt noticed that Reginald's pleasant smile vanished whenever no one looked directly at him. His gaze lingered upon the family's joy with unsettling intensity, lingering especially upon the twins who represented everything he could never possess. Later that evening, a worried steward quietly mentioned that Master Reginald's gambling debts had grown alarmingly large. Mrs. Pruitt offered no reply, though unease settled heavily in her heart. Long after the children drifted asleep beneath Eleanor's gentle lullaby, Reginald slipped into a forgotten study, unlocked an iron safe concealed behind an ancestral portrait, unfolded a creditor's ultimatum, and stared at a document declaring him heir should Alexander's legitimate family ever disappear. His slow smile returned, colder than moonlight, as the distant sound of Eleanor's song faded into silence. Moonlight pooled across the deserted corridors of Whitmore Hall, turning polished floors into mirrors where every shadow appeared deeper than it truly was. While the household slept peacefully, cousin Reginald Ashford remained awake inside a forgotten study, surrounded by ledgers, blank parchment, sealing wax, and carefully sharpened quills. His debts had become impossible to conceal, his creditors impatient, and the inheritance he coveted seemed forever beyond reach while Alexander's happy family flourished. Desperation had slowly transformed envy into calculation, and calculation into something far darker. Reginald understood Alexander better than anyone realized. He knew the Duke's greatest weakness had never been pride alone but the wound left by childhood memories that refused to fade. Alexander had watched his own father crumble after discovering his mother's infidelity, and the scandal had poisoned every lesson he learned about trust. His father had become withdrawn, bitter, and broken before dying years too early, leaving behind a son who silently vowed never to endure such humiliation himself. Reginald intended to awaken those buried fears with ruthless precision. A single forged letter would never be enough to shatter a marriage built upon 15 years of devotion. Alexander loved Eleanor too deeply for that. Instead, Reginald decided to construct an entire false reality, one convincing enough that every innocent coincidence would appear to confirm the lie. He began by inventing Captain Edmund Ashworth, a distinguished cavalry officer whose name existed nowhere except upon parchment written by Reginald's own careful hand. Night after night, he composed affectionate letters between Eleanor and the imaginary captain, practicing her graceful handwriting until every curve resembled hers without becoming an exact copy. He stole one of Eleanor's ribbons while the household prepared for Sunday chapel, then quietly removed a stick of wax from her writing desk, knowing Alexander would recognize the family seal without questioning how it had been obtained. He purchased imported ink from a traveling merchant, selected paper similar to Eleanor's personal stationery, and even sprinkled faint traces of lavender between folded pages because the Duchess always kept dried flowers among her correspondence. Every detail mattered. Lies survived only when they resembled truth more closely than truth resembled itself. His deception spread beyond paper. Reginald bribed a stable boy to record the arrival of a carriage that had never existed. He persuaded an innkeeper outside the county to sign a receipt bearing Captain Ashworth's fabricated name. A desperate former clerk, eager for easy money, agreed to copy military records suggesting the captain had indeed passed through the region months earlier. Reginald even paid two strangers to claim they had witnessed Eleanor speaking privately with an unknown gentleman near the village church. None of them understood the larger scheme. Each believed they were performing a harmless favor for an influential nobleman. The final piece required no payment at all. Reginald approached Whitmore Hall's loyal steward wearing a mask of reluctant concern. With measured hesitation, he confessed that he feared malicious gossip might someday damage the Duchess's reputation. The steward dismissed the suggestion immediately, offended by the very possibility. Reginald apologized, withdrew, and quietly left one forged letter hidden beneath account books in the estate office. He knew exactly who would discover it and exactly what that honest man would do. Loyalty, when manipulated correctly, could become the sharpest weapon imaginable. Days passed without incident. Eleanor continued filling the house with laughter, unaware that invisible threads were tightening around her life. Alexander noticed nothing unusual beyond his cousin's unusually thoughtful behavior. Mrs. Pruitt, however, sensed an unease she could neither explain nor dismiss. She twice found Reginald wandering hallways after midnight and once caught him studying Eleanor's writing desk with unsettling fascination. When she mentioned her concerns to Dr. Langley during his routine visit, the physician smiled politely but promised to remain observant. Neither realized events had already moved beyond quiet suspicion. On a gray morning veiled in mist, the steward entered Alexander's private study carrying a sealed envelope with trembling hands. He explained that he had discovered it accidentally among estate papers and believed the Duke alone should decide what it meant. Alexander accepted the letter with puzzled gratitude, broke the familiar wax seal, and unfolded the pages slowly. As his eyes traveled across the intimate words addressed to Captain Edmund Ashworth, the color drained from his face. The room remained perfectly silent, yet somewhere deep within his memory, the echoes of his father's shattered life awakened once again. Morning arrived beneath a sky of pale silver, yet no light could soften the heaviness inside Whitmore Hall. The breakfast table had been prepared with its usual elegance, fresh flowers standing beside polished silver, warm bread resting beneath embroidered linen, and steaming tea filling the room with comforting fragrance. Everything appeared unchanged, but an invisible fracture already divided the family that had seemed unbreakable only the evening before. Duke Alexander Whitmore sat at the head of the table, motionless, the folded letter resting beside his untouched cup. His sleepless eyes carried the weight of an entire lifetime's fear. Eleanor entered moments later, smiling as Thomas and Henry hurried ahead of her, laughing over whose wooden horse had won yesterday's imaginary tournament. She greeted her husband with gentle affection, noticing his silence but assuming exhaustion from London. Leaning forward, she asked softly whether he had slept poorly. Alexander answered only by sliding the folded letter across the polished table. His voice remained frighteningly calm. "Tell me, Eleanor, who is Captain Edmund Ashworth?" She frowned, reading the unfamiliar name twice before looking back at him in bewilderment. "I have never heard that name before." Alexander's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Read the letter." Eleanor unfolded the pages. Her smile disappeared almost instantly. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then horror, as she recognized fragments of her own handwriting woven into words she had never written. Her breathing became uneven. She searched every line again, hoping understanding might appear if she simply looked long enough. "This is not mine," she whispered. "Someone forged this." Alexander rose slowly from his chair. "They used your seal. They stole it. They knew your handwriting. They copied it. They knew your perfume. They stole that too." Every answer she gave sounded truthful, yet every answer also seemed impossible. The evidence before him matched every terror buried inside Alexander since childhood. He no longer saw the woman he loved. He saw only his father's haunted face after discovering another betrayal hidden beneath respectable appearances. Thomas looked nervously between his parents. "Father?" Alexander did not answer. Mrs. Pruitt hurried into the room after hearing raised voices. One glance at Eleanor's trembling hands told her something terrible had happened. "Your Grace," she pleaded carefully, "whatever this may be, perhaps it deserves privacy before judgment." Alexander's voice cracked beneath restrained anguish. "I have given this family everything. And your wife has given you nothing but loyalty," Mrs. Pruitt answered firmly. Before Alexander could respond, Dr. Langley entered unexpectedly, arriving for a scheduled examination of estate workers. Seeing the strained faces, he immediately sensed disaster. "My friend," he said quietly, "do nothing you cannot undo." Alexander thrust the letter toward him. "Can you undo this?" Langley glanced over the page without speaking. "I can examine it," he replied. "That is not the same as believing it." But reason had already lost its place inside Alexander's wounded heart. He summoned the household staff. Servants filled the entrance hall in uneasy silence. Thomas and Henry clung to Eleanor's skirts, frightened by the unfamiliar tension surrounding the adults they trusted. Reginald stood quietly near the staircase, his expression carefully arranged into sympathetic concern. Alexander faced his wife before everyone. "You have shamed this house." Eleanor stared at him through tears. "No, Alexander. Please, look at me, not that letter." His voice finally exploded with unbearable pain. "I did look at you. For 15 years. She stepped toward him. "Then trust those years." Instead he called the twins forward. Thomas reached for his father's hand, but Alexander could not bring himself to take it. The silence became almost unbearable. Then came the words that shattered everything. "Take the children and leave Whitmore Hall before sunset. I will not raise another man's disgrace beneath my roof." A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Henry burst into tears. Thomas simply stood frozen, staring at the man he admired most. "Father," he asked in a tiny voice, "did we do something wrong?" Alexander opened his mouth, yet no words emerged. Eleanor gathered both boys close, her own heart breaking with every breath. She neither shouted nor defended herself again. Looking into Alexander's grief-stricken eyes, she spoke with heartbreaking gentleness. "One day the truth will find you. I only pray it does not arrive too late." She turned and walked toward the waiting carriage, one small hand holding Thomas, the other holding Henry. Neither boy looked ahead. Both kept looking back, hoping their father would stop them before the great doors closed forever. From an upstairs window, hidden behind heavy velvet curtains, Reginald watched the broken family depart, and the smallest smile crossed his lips as the carriage disappeared beyond the gates. Twilight settled over Whitmore Hall like a morning veil, draining the last warmth from its gilded windows until the magnificent estate felt strangely abandoned. Only hours earlier its corridors had echoed with childish laughter, hurried footsteps, and Eleanor's gentle voice calling the twins inside before supper. Now every room seemed to hold its breath. The silence was so complete that the ticking of the great-grandfather clock sounded almost accusatory, measuring each passing second since Alexander had watched his own family disappear beyond the gates. The Duke wandered through the entrance hall without purpose, his polished boots striking the marble with lonely echoes that returned unanswered. Habit guided him toward the nursery before memory stopped him at the doorway. Thomas's wooden soldiers remained lined neatly across the carpet exactly where the boy had arranged them the previous evening. Henry's unfinished model sailing ship still rested upon the windowsill beside scattered carving tools too dangerous for small hands without supervision. Everything waited faithfully for children who no longer belonged there. Alexander stepped inside anyway. He picked up one of the carved soldiers, turning it slowly between his fingers as though expecting it to explain how happiness could vanish in a single morning. Instead, he found only painful reminders. A half-read adventure book lay open beside the bed where he had promised to finish the story that very night. 2 tiny jackets still hung beside the wardrobe. One carried a loose button Eleanor had planned to sew back before winter arrived. She never would. Unable to remain in the nursery, he crossed the gallery overlooking the gardens. The fountain sparkled beneath the fading light, but its beauty felt empty without 2 energetic boys racing around its edge. Every familiar place had become another witness against him. Even the roses Eleanor had planted appeared neglected already, though only a few hours had passed since she had lovingly trimmed them herself. He entered the family drawing room and stopped before the large portrait completed the previous spring. The painting captured a perfect afternoon beneath blooming chestnut trees. Eleanor sat smiling upon a garden bench while Thomas and Henry leaned against her shoulders, laughing at something beyond the artist's canvas. Alexander stood behind them, one hand resting proudly upon Eleanor's shoulder. Looking at the portrait now, he scarcely recognized the confident man gazing back. He reached out instinctively, tracing Eleanor's painted face with his thumb before lowering his hand in shame. A crystal glass of whiskey waited untouched upon the nearby table. He poured another measure but could not bring himself to drink. The amber liquid reflected the dancing firelight, reminding him of evenings when Eleanor would gently steal the glass from his hand and insist he join the children for one last bedtime story instead. Those ordinary moments, once taken for granted, now felt more precious than every title, estate, and honor attached to his name. Soft footsteps approached behind him. Mrs. Pruitt entered carrying a lit oil lamp whose golden glow pushed back the gathering darkness. She placed it quietly upon the table before studying Alexander with sorrow rather than anger. 30 years of loyal service had taught her exactly when silence healed and when truth demanded a voice. "Your Grace," she said gently, "I dressed the Duchess on her wedding morning. I held both boys moments after they were born. I have watched that woman choose this family every single day. I cannot believe one letter outweighs 15 years of love." Alexander closed his eyes. "The evidence is overwhelming. So was your happiness yesterday." Her words struck harder than accusation ever could. Mrs. Pruitt reached into her apron pocket and carefully placed a folded envelope beside the whiskey glass. "The Duchess asked me to leave this where only you would find it." Without another word, she bowed and quietly departed, leaving the Duke alone with the letter. For several long minutes Alexander simply stared at Eleanor's familiar handwriting upon the envelope. His fingers trembled before finally breaking the seal. Inside there were no furious accusations, no desperate attempts to defend herself, only quiet heartbreak. She wrote that she did not understand why he believed a stranger over the woman who had shared his life, but begged him never to let Thomas and Henry think their father had stopped loving them. As tears blurred the final lines, another knock sounded at the study door. Dr. Langley's calm voice carried through the silence. "Alexander," he called softly, "before this tragedy becomes permanent, allow me to examine every piece of evidence with fresh eyes." Before dawn broke over Whitmore Hall, Dr. Langley spread every document across the Duke's study, arranging each letter, receipt, and statement with the precision of a physician diagnosing a hidden illness. Alexander stood nearby, exhausted and hollow-eyed, while the first pale light slipped through the curtains. For the first time since Eleanor's departure, someone examined the evidence without anger. Silence filled the room except for the rustle of paper and the slow crackle of dying embers in the fireplace. Langley lifted the forged letter beneath the window. "Look closely," he said. "Your wife always finishes the letter E with a narrow upward loop. Here the writer ends downward." Alexander stared, noticing the difference immediately. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet unmistakable once seen. The physician compared another genuine note written by Eleanor months earlier. The similarities remained impressive, but the rhythm of the handwriting belonged to another hand entirely. Next came the ink. Langley dipped a clean quill into fresh water and touched the corner of the forged page. "Imported French ink," he murmured. "Your stationer has never stocked this blend." Eleanor had always purchased ordinary local supplies because she insisted expensive ink was wasteful. Alexander remembered teasing her about that habit, and the memory cut deeper than any accusation. The wax seal troubled Langley even more. He examined its impression through a small brass magnifier kept inside his medical case. "The seal is genuine," he admitted, "but it was pressed by someone unfamiliar with it. See this uneven edge? Eleanor never leaves that mark." Piece by piece, certainty began dissolving into dreadful doubt. Alexander summoned the loyal steward who had delivered the letter. The old servant arrived visibly shaken. Under gentle questioning, he confessed that he had discovered the envelope exactly where Cousin Reginald suggested estate accounts might have been misplaced. Reginald himself had insisted the Duke alone should inspect whatever was found. The steward had believed he was protecting his master from scandal. Instead, he had unknowingly carried poison into the heart of the household. Without another word, Alexander strode toward Reginald's chambers, Langley following close behind. Every corridor seemed longer than before, every step heavier with growing remorse. Reginald's rooms appeared perfectly ordered until Alexander unlocked a writing cabinet hidden behind shelves of expensive books. Inside rested a bottle of imported French ink identical to the physician's description. Beneath it lay practice sheets covered with countless attempts to imitate Eleanor's graceful handwriting. Hope and horror collided within Alexander's chest. He searched further, overturning neatly folded clothes and opening locked drawers. Beneath a stack of unpaid gambling notices rested several partially burned papers. Langley carefully separated the fragile scraps. Together they reconstructed enough lines to reveal an unfinished draft addressed to Captain Edmund Ashworth. The wording matched the forged letter almost exactly. Another drawer contained receipts for large payments made to strangers from neighboring towns. One receipt bore the name of the village innkeeper whose testimony had supported the imaginary captain's visit. Every discovery tightened the same invisible chain until only one conclusion remained possible. Alexander closed his eyes. "I condemned my wife before asking a single question." "You condemned yourself as well," Langley answered quietly. "Now decide whether regret will become action." At that moment the study door opened. Reginald entered confidently, but his smile faded the instant he saw the evidence spread across the desk. Alexander faced him without shouting. The terrible calm in his voice carried far greater weight than fury ever could. "Tell me," the Duke said, "how much was my family worth to you?" Reginald's silence lasted only a heartbeat before years of concealed bitterness erupted. He confessed that every joyful meal, every laugh shared between Alexander and Eleanor, every embrace with the twins had reminded him of everything birth had denied him. He never wanted Eleanor's love. He wanted Alexander's life, his title, his heirs, and the future that should never have belonged to another man in his eyes. Alexander summoned the estate constable. Before witnesses, he stripped Reginald of every privilege, dismissed him from Whitmore Hall, and ordered charges of fraud, forgery, bribery, and conspiracy prepared immediately. As guards escorted the defeated conspirator away, Alexander remained motionless, staring toward the empty nursery upstairs. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Find my wife and my sons," he said, gripping Eleanor's letter until the paper crumpled inside his trembling hand. "If I am too late, I shall spend the rest of my life knowing I destroyed my own family with a lie." Rain swept across the countryside as Duke Alexander Whitmore rode from village to village without escort, refusing the comfort of a grand carriage or the dignity expected of his rank. Every mile seemed to carry him farther from the proud man who had once believed certainty required no questions. Mud stained his boots, exhaustion shadowed his face, and sleep became an indulgence he no longer deserved. Wherever he stopped, he asked only one question: whether anyone had seen a gentle lady traveling with two 7-year-old twin boys. Meanwhile, Eleanor had found shelter in the modest stone cottage of her widowed Aunt Margaret, whose small farm rested on the edge of the county where rolling hills gave way to quiet woodland. The cottage possessed none of Whitmore Hall's grandeur. Its roof leaked during heavy rain, its furniture bore decades of careful repairs, and its fireplace warmed only one room at a time. Yet it offered something the great estate no longer could: peace without judgment. Thomas and Henry struggled to understand the sudden change. They missed their spacious nursery, their favored horses, and the familiar servants who had watched them grow. More than anything, they missed their father. Thomas secretly carried Alexander's old pocket watch everywhere he went, polishing its silver cover whenever sadness overcame him. Henry refused to sleep unless he wrapped himself in the hunting scarf his father had once left beside the nursery door. Neither child spoke with anger. Their hearts were too innocent for bitterness. They simply waited for an explanation that never came. Eleanor refused to poison their memories with resentment. Each evening she sat beside the fire, reading stories exactly as she had at Whitmore Hall, gently reminding the boys that love could survive even when people made terrible mistakes. Whenever Thomas quietly asked whether father still loved them, tears threatened to betray her composure, yet she always answered with quiet certainty. "Love sometimes loses its way," she whispered. "But that does not mean it disappears." To help Aunt Margaret, Eleanor sold a small pearl bracelet Alexander had given her on their 5th wedding anniversary. The jeweler offered less than it was worth, yet she accepted without complaint. The money bought flour, medicine, warm blankets, and enough food to spare her aunt unnecessary hardship. Watching Eleanor work beside the elderly widow, the twins began helping however they could. Thomas chopped kindling under careful supervision, while Henry proudly gathered fresh eggs every morning, determined to become useful despite his young age. Back at Whitmore Hall, every familiar place became another reminder of failure. Alexander could no longer pass the orchard without remembering Thomas climbing its oldest apple tree. He avoided the fountain where Henry had once insisted ducks understood polite conversation. Even Eleanor's rose garden remained untouched because he could not bear disturbing the flowers she had planted with her own hands. Regret followed him more faithfully than any servant ever had. Weeks passed before a traveling merchant mentioned seeing a noblewoman matching Eleanor's description near the woodland farms beyond Ashcombe Ridge. Alexander mounted his horse before dawn the following morning and rode harder than he had since his military service. Hope and fear battled within him with every stride. He prayed only for one chance to face the family he had so recklessly cast aside. As evening approached, he reached the quiet valley where the merchant had pointed. Hidden behind flowering hedges stood a weathered cottage glowing warmly beneath the setting sun. Alexander remained outside the wooden gate, unable to move. Through the kitchen window he saw Eleanor kneading bread while Aunt Margaret laughed beside her. Thomas carefully measured flour, pretending great importance, while Henry proudly presented freshly gathered eggs with theatrical delight. Their laughter floated through the open window, softer than before yet unmistakably genuine. Alexander realized the cruelest truth of all. Life had continued without him. The family he loved had learned to smile again despite the wound he had inflicted. His presence was no longer the center of their happiness but the source of its deepest sorrow. He removed his hat, placed a bundle of wildflowers and a handwritten letter beside the garden gate, then turned silently toward his horse. Before he could ride away, the cottage door creaked open behind him, and Eleanor stepped onto the worn stone path, her eyes meeting his across the fading light. Eleanor stood silently upon the cottage path, the evening breeze stirring loose strands of chestnut hair across her face as she looked at the man she had once trusted above everyone else. Alexander removed his hat and lowered his eyes, unable to meet her gaze for more than a moment. The wildflowers rested forgotten beside the gate, looking painfully humble against the weight of everything that had been broken. Neither of them spoke at first. Some wounds were too deep for hurried words. At last Eleanor broke the silence. "Have you come to apologize?" she asked quietly, "or to give another order?" The question struck Alexander harder than any accusation could have. Every command he had ever given as Duke had carried unquestioned authority, yet the one command he most wished to erase had driven away the only people who had ever loved him without fear. "I came," he answered, his voice trembling, "because I finally learned the truth. Reginald forged every letter, every witness, every piece of evidence. Dr. Langley proved it. Reginald confessed before the estate constable. He has been stripped of everything." Eleanor listened without interruption. Relief flickered briefly across her face, not because she had been proven innocent, but because the lie poisoning Alexander's heart had finally died. Yet the relief could not erase the memory of standing before the servants while her husband condemned her without mercy. "You believed him," she whispered. "You did not believe me." Alexander nodded. "I know. Nothing more. No excuses. No mention of childhood fears or old scars. Only the terrible truth." He slowly dropped to one knee upon the damp earth, an act almost unimaginable for a duke whose pride had once seemed unshakable. "I failed you," he said. "Not because I believed a forgery but because I forgot 15 years of your character in a single terrible morning. I allowed old wounds to speak louder than the woman who stood beside me every day of my life. I do not deserve forgiveness. I only ask for the chance to earn it." Behind Eleanor, the cottage door opened wider. Thomas and Henry stepped outside together. For one suspended moment, nobody moved. Henry ran first. "Father." Alexander caught the boy in his arms, holding him so tightly that tears finally escaped the composure he had maintained for weeks. Henry wrapped both arms around his neck, crying openly. Thomas remained where he was, older in spirit than any 7-year-old should ever become. He approached slowly until standing only a few feet away. "Is it true?" he asked. Alexander swallowed. "Yes." "You really thought Mother lied?" "I did." "You thought we weren't your sons?" Alexander closed his eyes. "I was wrong." Thomas studied him carefully. Children often accepted apologies more honestly than adults, yet they also recognized sincerity with remarkable clarity. "How do we know," Thomas asked softly, "that next time someone tells you another lie, you won't send us away again?" The question left the entire garden silent. Alexander searched desperately for comforting words but found none worthy of the moment. "You don't," he admitted. "Not today. Not because I ask you to trust me again. You will know only by watching what I choose every day from now until I take my last breath. Trust cannot be commanded. I must deserve it." Thomas looked toward his mother. Eleanor saw something different in Alexander's face now. The certainty that had once ruled him had been replaced by humility. The proud duke had disappeared. Before her knelt only a husband carrying unbearable remorse. She helped Alexander rise. "I forgive the man who came here today," she said gently. "But forgiveness is not the same as healing. I understand. Our family cannot return because one confession erased one mistake." "I know." "Then let time decide what words cannot." Alexander accepted her answer without argument. He kissed each of the twins upon the forehead, thanked Aunt Margaret for sheltering them, and quietly walked back toward his waiting horse. He never once asked Eleanor to come home. As he mounted the saddle, Thomas suddenly hurried after him and pressed the old silver pocket watch into his father's hand. "You should keep it," the boy said, "until we're a family again." Alexander stared at the treasured watch, unable to speak. As he looked back, Eleanor remained standing beside the cottage, her eyes filled not with certainty, but with the smallest spark of hope either of them had felt since the day everything fell apart. Months passed, and autumn slowly painted the forests surrounding Whitmore Hall with gold and crimson, as though the land itself believed broken things could become beautiful again. During those quiet weeks, Alexander never tried to force his way back into Eleanor's life. Instead, he allowed his actions to speak where his words had failed. Every false accusation against Eleanor was publicly withdrawn before neighboring nobles, the family solicitor, and the county magistrate. Reginald's confession was entered into the official record, restoring Eleanor's honor beyond question. Alexander quietly sold several valuable racehorses to repay every expense Aunt Margaret had carried while sheltering his family, though the elderly widow accepted the gift only after learning it came without pride attached. Every Sunday, Alexander delivered a letter to the cottage, never expecting a reply. Sometimes he enclosed pressed flowers from Eleanor's rose garden. Sometimes he included little sketches of new wooden toys he was carving for the twins. Every letter ended with the same promise: "I will wait as long as healing requires." Eleanor read every page before placing them carefully inside a small oak box. She answered none of them, yet she no longer cried after reading them. Slowly, the anger protecting her heart gave way to quiet hope. Thomas and Henry noticed the change first. Their father never demanded visits, never sent expensive gifts to purchase affection, and never blamed anyone else for what had happened. One crisp afternoon, the twins quietly asked whether they could visit Whitmore Hall. Eleanor looked toward Aunt Margaret, who simply smiled and nodded. "A home deserves the chance to become a home again," the old widow said gently. When the carriage reached the familiar gates, Alexander was already waiting outside instead of inside the grand entrance. He wore no ceremonial coat, only a simple brown jacket with rolled sleeves stained by fresh paint. Behind him, servants were hanging new swings beneath the ancient oak where the twins had always loved to play. He had spent the entire morning helping them with his own hands. Henry jumped from the carriage first and ran into his father's embrace. Thomas followed more slowly, studying Alexander's face before offering a small smile. Alexander knelt to greet them both equally, refusing to let either child feel overlooked for even a heartbeat. Eleanor stepped from the carriage last. She looked across the gardens where every rosebush had been carefully restored, every broken fence repaired, every flower bed flourishing exactly as she had once imagined. Nothing had been changed to erase her memory. Everything had been preserved to honor it. "The house looks the same," she said softly. Alexander smiled gently. "The walls are the same. The man who lives inside them is not." He invited her to walk through the estate without expectation. Every room carried small signs of change. The nursery contained a new bookshelf Alexander had built himself. The servants' dining room had been enlarged because Eleanor had once suggested they deserved greater comfort. A schoolroom had been opened for the children of estate workers, fulfilling a dream she had often spoken about. The servants greeted Eleanor not with formal bows but with tears of relief, and she embraced each of them as though no time had passed. As evening approached, Alexander led his family into the great dining hall. The same golden light that had welcomed them before the tragedy now poured through the tall windows once more. Mrs. Pruitt stood quietly near the doorway, unable to hide joyful tears, while Dr. Langley watched with grateful satisfaction. The familiar table had been set exactly as it had been on that final peaceful evening, except one place held a single white rose beside Eleanor's plate. Alexander rose, lifted a crystal glass, and looked only at his wife. "This family survived because one woman refused to answer cruelty with hatred," he said. "Everything good that remains in my life stands because of your courage. If these children learn wisdom, let it come from their mother. If they learn humility, let them learn from my failure. I spent years believing strength meant never questioning my own judgment. Now I know true strength begins the moment pride gives way to truth." The hall fell completely silent. Alexander slowly removed the signet ring from his finger, the symbol of his authority as Duke, and placed it before Eleanor. "The title made me powerful," he said quietly. "Your love made me worthy of it. If ever I become the man who sent you away again, I would rather lose this ring than lose my family." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She gently closed his fingers around the ring and placed his hand against her heart. "You have already paid for that mistake," she whispered. "Do not spend the rest of your life living in yesterday. Spend it walking beside us into tomorrow." Thomas smiled first. Henry laughed next. Soon all four of them were laughing together, and the sound swept through Whitmore Hall with a warmth no fire could ever equal. Months later, a celebrated painter returned to complete a new family portrait. This time Alexander refused grand poses and solemn expressions. Instead, he asked the artist to capture an ordinary evening beside the fireplace, where Eleanor read aloud while Thomas leaned against his father's shoulder and Henry laughed as the family dog chased its own tail across the rug. When the finished portrait was hung above the mantel, Alexander slipped his hand into Eleanor's, the twins stood proudly beside them, and the bells of the village church rang across the valley as another golden sunset settled upon the home that had nearly lost its heart forever, but had found it again through truth, humility, forgiveness, and a love that would never again be taken for granted.